Welcome back to the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to preserving the history of boxing and its larger-than-life characters, and is brought to you by Clear Contender Media. Now, here's your host, Casey Kid History Callanan.
Welcome back to the Characters of Boxing podcast. Dana White has been in the news a lot recently, and he's talking about how he wants to get involved in boxing. And he's also has a strong background in boxing, as we'll get into later in this episode, as a trainer, and has a pretty interesting story about how he got kicked out of Boston. So Dana White, he's claiming the system in boxing is broken, with all these different governing bodies, with all these different promotions, with all these separate interests that are involved in the sport. The end result is the fans are losing out because the best fighters are not fighting the best fighters. So Dana White has been public that he wants to get involved in boxing. Dana White claims that his history of making sure the best fighters fight the best fighters, in the UFC, he wants to bring that to the world of boxing. So stay tuned, as Dana White, as early as this month, looks to get into boxing. But Dana White is obviously a large personality. He has been the face of UFC after acquiring it in 2001 with his two business partners. He's been the complete face of the UFC. It's been a personality-driven promotion. He's been, I don't want to say micromanaging it, because I don't really know what goes on in the day in, day out business operations, but he certainly reminds me of Vince McMahon, who rolls his sleeves up and makes sure that for the longest time the WWE was ran based on kind of the personality and the drive and the showmanship of the owner, and the driving force behind these two promotions have certainly been Dana White in the UFC and Vince McMahon in the WWE. So they very much remind me of each other. They're, tough guys who have definitely, built something from just about nothing, as we will talk about when I watched a really interesting little short documentary put on by the UFC called 3 Guys and 3 Letters. I think it's on YouTube. It's got over 1 million views. So, I learned a lot about the history behind Dana White's involvement in the UFC, and I think it's a really fascinating story, and I think Dana White's a massive character, and I think he's punched his ticket for a profile on the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. So Dana White was born in 1969. He's 50 years old. He's from the New England area. Now, there is a conflicting report that I found from his Wikipedia page with the video that I watched about him and the Fertitta brothers, who are his business partners with the UFC. There was a conflicting report that said on Wikipedia, and of course we know Wikipedia is user-generated content, so anybody can update Wikipedia, but Wikipedia said that he went to high school in Maine, but then I believe in the video I watched that was produced by the UFC, they said that he was high school buddies with one of the Fertitta brothers, and the Fertitta brothers were from Las Vegas. So I'm not sure what the truth is there, but it is well documented that Dana White is from New England. It says he was born in Manchester, Connecticut, and he also spent a significant amount of time in the state of Massachusetts. In fact, probably one of the most famous stories about Dana White's youth that we know of, or not necessarily his youth, but in his early pre-UFC years, is a story that involves the mobster Whitey Bulger. And Whitey Bulger was a part of, and I think the other his right-hand man was named Kevin Weeks, and they obviously had a large-scale presence in Boston for a long time when, Dana White was kind of coming of age. And Dana White actually trained fighters in South Boston, and one day, Whitey Bulger's people just came right into the gym where Dana White was doing business and training fighters, albeit he was not making a lot of money. And they claimed that he was doing business in their neighborhood and they owed him money. I believe the figure was $2,500, and Dana White simply didn't have the money, so he ignored it until one day they called him and said, pay up now or else, pay up tomorrow, I think was the ultimatum, or we all know what would happen, and it wouldn't have been good for Dana White. So he simply picked up the phone, as he says, after he got off that phone call, called Delta and moved to Las Vegas. So as there's been interviews that I've seen about with him talking about this event, he goes and he has a famous quote where he says, life is so difficult to judge or ascertain or understand, because the worst thing that ever happened to him, getting that call and that visit from Whitey Bulger and his people, ended up being the greatest thing that ever happened to him. So the worst thing turns into the best thing ever, because X amount of years later, he was leading the UFC along with his two business partners, the Fertittas. And we know what the end result of that was, and that's selling UFC to WME, which is the huge talent agency that merged with IMG. And they made $4 billion when the UFC was sold in 2016. So it all ended up being a good blessing in disguise. But hey, listen, anytime you get a visit from mobsters and they're asking for money that you don't have, and then the fact that can turn into something advantageous is something that takes, decades to come to fruition. But luckily for Dana White, it ultimately ended up all working out. So when he gets to Las Vegas, he's friendly with these guys, Lorenzo Fertitta and Frank Fertitta. These are two brothers who were sons of Frank Fertitta Jr., who was a large casino magnate in Las Vegas. And so these guys had a lot of money, and Dana White was evidently childhood friends with one of them. And the next thing you know, they're all rubbing elbows. They're all in the kind of that training community where, you kind of see people day in and day out in the gym, or in Las Vegas, they see guys like Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz. And the next thing you know, Dana White is actually Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz promoter. So, he just falls in love with this mixed martial art, which is at the time a new thing. And what was happening with the UFC at the time was it was ran by a guy named Bob Meyerowitz, and Meyerowitz had a parent company that actually was one of the first companies ever that produced content for pay-per-view. So, that makes sense because UFC made its debut on pay-per-view in 1993, which we've done an episode about. It's called UFC 1. We've done a Characters of Boxing profile about all the characters that were involved in UFC 1. And Bob Meyerowitz's parent company was the people that owned the UFC and owned those letters and that branding, and they had the promotion out there. Now, the problem that Meyerowitz was running into is he wasn't able to be turning a large profit at all because people were really turning on UFC. Certainly the regulators and state commissions were banning it. And it was banned from television, cable television, and it was also banned from pay-per-view television in the United States. So it was in a really bad spot, and it wasn't worth a lot of money. Meyerowitz had, his company had invented it, so to speak. Invented this crazy octagon and this event that was supposed to answer the age-old question of what was the best martial arts, and he owned all of it. He had a bunch of contracts, and, it was really entertaining, but it was really struggling because it wasn't being accepted by the mainstream, and the regulators are always going to win. The United States government is always going to win. So you have to learn how to play by their rules, or you have to get savvy at petitioning your government, which is in the Constitution, that we're all allowed to petition and lobby our officials, and so that's exactly what would end up happening. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but what Meyerowitz's problem was that he was running into is it wasn't getting mainstream acceptance, and it was really doing poorly from a financial standpoint. So in the community of Las Vegas at that time, Dana White finds out that Meyerowitz is down on his luck with this promotion. Dana White approaches his two buddies, Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta, who are, have all this casino family wealth. And next thing you know, these guys are making an offer to Bob Meyerowitz, and Meyerowitz comes back and says he wants $2 million for the UFC, for the Octagon, and all the contracts that he had. He didn't have much, but he was going to put a price tag of $2 million on it. And the Fertitta brothers, who don't get a lot of, from what I understand, people don't talk about the Fertitta brothers, but you have to understand that the Fertitta brothers, they put their money where their mouth was. It was their money. They were taking on the risk, and they pegged Dana White to do it because they believed in him. They believed in his personality. They believed in his savvy and in his passion and his street smarts. And, look at what happened. And Dana White definitely was a street smart individual. He had run-ins with the mob in Boston, and, he knew what was out there, and he knew, he was a rough and tumble guy who could withstand and deal with some of the unpleasantness that can come with running a business and trying to get a business off the ground. So Dana White and the Fertitta brothers buy the UFC from Meyerowitz, and then in February of 2001, the first Fertitta brothers / Dana White promotion is put on. They have a parent company that they created called Zuffa, Zuffa, which they say, and I do not speak Italian, is the Italian word for, I believe, fight. So this parent company they all formed, Zuffa, runs the first UFC event in 2001, and unfortunately they are not making a ton of money in the first 3-4 years of this endeavor, because the business of the UFC, it is very resource intensive. It's a lot of overhead from a financial standpoint, because you have these rings and you have all these contracts. It is something that you really have to, if you want to make money in, you have to be in it for the long haul. I am certainly not a combat sports promoter, but I do have a lot of respect for all the risk that these businessmen, your Eddie Hearns and all the guys that, put on large fights, your Al Haymans, these guys are taking on a lot of business risk. And I want to mention Al Heyman and PBC later in this podcast, because there is rumors floating about that, Dana White has been in talks to try to buy PBC. So they buy it from Meyerowitz. First 4 or 5 years, they're not getting their bang for their buck. And at the same time, I'm saying UFC's fights are they're costing the company tons of money. And at the same time, they're trying hard to petition these state commissions. They're trying all they can do to get UFC back on cable, to get it back on pay-per-view in America. They're trying to work with the state commissions so that the state commissions will allow the fights to be held in these states at these very desirable locations. That when Meyerowitz was running the UFC, they couldn't hold these, events at huge venues because they weren't being sanctioned. And actually the state of New York, I think only like 5 years ago, it might be a little bit longer than that, but only like 5 years ago, the UFC was even allowed in the state of New York. I think that's kind of famously the example. But, these guys in the opening years of owning UFC, I'm talking about the Fertittas and Dana Whites, they were struggling really hard to get it legitimized by the state commissions, and they were also losing money. So it was ugly, very ugly in the beginning. Say they're about 3-4 years in now. The Fertittas and Dana White, they're down about $45 million. So they've invested about $45 million. And at that point, I would be pulling my hair out, right? And, so Dana White gets on the phone and sees what he could sell it for. They've already lost about $45 million, and he's understanding that, they could only get about $7 or $8 million for it now. So that would be, by all accounts, a terrible business deal. And Dana White, he is, the driving force behind it all. Lorenzo and Frank, the Fertitta brothers, are certainly the backers financially, but at 3 or 4 years in, the Fertitta brothers were ready to pull out completely and say, you've lost our family too much money. We can't keep doing this. At that do or die moment, something within the Fertitta brothers just clicked and said, nah, we have to keep going. We have to keep going. And they got creative, because at this point in our, in our country, in America, in our pop culture, reality TV was like king. MTV, Spike TV, whatever channel you watched on basic cable had like a hit reality TV show. And these Fertitta brothers and Dana White, they had this genius idea for a show called The Ultimate Fighter. And, they worked their butt off to pitch this thing to the networks, and no one seemed to be wanting to touch it. But somehow, some way, the Fertitta brothers, along with Dana White, they came up with about $10 million and said, hey, look, if you put Spike TV, is Spike TV still a thing? I don't even know. I've been a cable cutter for so long. But I don't know if Spike TV still exists. But at the time, Spike TV was like marketed heavily for like, men, it's the guys channel, And so Spike TV didn't want to put it on. But this legendary trio of Lorenzo, Frank, and Dana White, they say, hey, look, we'll give you $10 million. We'll pay for it all. We'll front the $10 million. We'll pay for it. Just please air it. Just put it on your network. And finally, Spike TV said, okay, we can work by those terms. But Ultimate Fighter would actually be kind of, from what I've seen and learned about this whole story, in the Dana White saga and the UFC story, that like, hey, that was it. Getting on The Ultimate Fighter brought UFC into people's living rooms. And then there was some epic Ultimate Fighter finales, I believe one involving Forrest Griffin, that made the UFC kind of what it is today. The Ultimate Fighter was the difference maker. Dana White was a huge character, as we know, and he called into one of my favorite radio shows ever. So I know a lot of people like Howard Stern. I love Howard Stern as well. But there's another two guys that created some great radio at their time, in their day. Maybe not the most politically correct content, of course, but these guys, Opie and Anthony, they always had... I'm a huge fan of comedy. I love comedy. But in Opie and Anthony, this radio show in America out of New York City, for sometimes it was in Boston as well. But Opie and Anthony always had all the comedians on. And that's why I fell in love with Opie and Anthony. They were what they call shock jocks. But O&A had the Patrice O'Neals on. They had the Bill Burrs on back in the day. They had these up-and-coming comedians that nobody really knew about. I always listen to like old episodes of Opie and Anthony because I love hearing like when a Bill Burr is on or something like that from back in the day, or a Patrice O'Neal, the late great Patrice O'Neal, great comedian. So I was listening to an old episode of Opie and Anthony, and who calls in but your boy Dana White? That's why Dana White was the man that the Fertitta brothers pegged to run this operation. Because Dana White was the guy that would call into Opie and Anthony. And he would promote this thing to the masses and get it out in front of the demographics that needed to hear about it. Because Opie and Anthony at that time was like the hottest show ever. It had the exact demo that UFC was trying to get out in front of, those guys from men 18 to like 39 or whatever that coveted demo is. That was the show. And Opie and Anthony was very selective of who could be on the show, right? They wouldn't just take any business guy. You had to be funny. You had to be entertaining. And there was a great product behind it. Everyone loved The Ultimate Fighter. Everyone loved UFC. So I was listening to an old episode of Opie and Anthony actually last night when I was doing some late night cooking and coming home from the supermarket. You know, I was making dinner, and so I'm listening to Opie and Anthony, and they're just, all these guys on Opie and Anthony, all these guests are just brutally roasting each other, and it's hilarious. And Dana White calls in, and all of a sudden everyone is super respectful. Jim Norton, you know, Opie, Anthony, Billy Burr, they're all being super respectful because they know that Dana White's the man. And what ends up happening is they talk about Ultimate Fighter, and Bill Burr has a hilarious line where he's like, yeah, you know, every other reality show, they get kicked off for some nonsense, baloney, like passive-aggressive reason. But in The Ultimate Fighter, they get their face knocked out, and then they get kicked off the show. So the fact that Dana White could call into the Opie and Anthony show, just, you know, you have to be a big character and you have to be a big brash personality to be able to pull that off. By 2005 or so, coming off the success of The Ultimate Fighter, coming off the breakout stardom of Chuck Liddell, starts to turn a profit, and then it would just be a huge, successful snowball after that. But the success of the UFC would just snowball, you know, completely after that, after, you know, these fortunate situations. And it was so savvy to get The Ultimate Fighter on the air, which was this reality show where I think like all the fighters would like live in a house, and then they would fight each other, and then whoever lost would get kicked out. So it was like 2005 at this point. Iceman Chuck Liddell is dominating, and he really became the breakout like star. Chuck Liddell was on the HBO show Entourage. He tried his hand in acting. He became a big pop culture star. He started to transcend UFC and enter into pop culture. And that's when you know you're onto something special. You know, when Hulk Hogan started breaking out of just being a superstar wrestler and transcending into pop culture in the 80s, you know, that is when Vince McMahon and the WWE knew that it had something special going on. You need those stars in your promotion that are going to transcend your sport and attract more audience that are going to see you hosting Saturday Night Live, or that are going to see you do some acting, you know. And that's exactly what Chuck Liddell did. He transcended the UFC. He was the biggest star going, and I don't have the proof to back it up, but with the success of Chuck Liddell came the success of the UFC, and from a financial standpoint. So Dana White did it all by being himself, you know, having fun. He's a tough guy. You know, he's a very savvy dude. Some of the public battles that he's had with Oscar De La Hoya and stuff like that, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he was calling like Oscar De La Hoya out in public and obviously using some very disrespectful language and stuff of that nature. But, that's kind of how he got to where he's at. You know, he's a very confrontational, tell it like it is, brash individual. And he's a no-nonsense guy. Now, do I agree with the fact that he's calling out guys like Oscar De La Hoya, who, you know, is one of the greatest fighters of all time? You know, it's tough. It's tough to have to see that. I wish part of me, you know, I'm a son of a social worker here. My mom is a social worker, and I want to see people play nice. You know, part of me always wants to see people play nice. But there is, you know, those public battles that he's fought, and I understand that it attracts attention. It attracts ratings. This is what personalities in the combat sports do, and they bring attention to their sport.
Thanks for listening to the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Clear Contender Media. For more, visit us on clearcontender.com.